It was a promise made in a smoke-filled room in 1922, a deal to divide a river that 7 ambitious men believed was infinite. 100 years later, that promise is officially bankrupt. The river is disappearing, and 40 million people across 2 countries are about to pay the price for a mathematical error made a century ago. The Colorado River, all 1,450 miles of it, is the artery of the American Southwest. But right now, that artery is hardening. Its 2 largest reservoirs, Lake Mead and Lake Powell, are shriveling. As of this year, Powell sits at just 24% capacity. Mead is barely better at 29%. This is not a drought. This is a system collapse, and the federal government is now preparing to intervene, to force cuts on states that refuse to give an inch. But here is the part they almost never tell you. This catastrophe wasn't an accident of nature. It wasn't just a megadrought. This crisis was engineered. It was written into law by men who were warned it would happen. So as the states brace for a legal battle over the last remaining drops, the question is no longer how do we fix this? It's what happens when the water is gone for good. Who is to blame for a crisis that was a century in the making? The founders who wrote the deal, the farms using most of the water, or the cities that grew in the desert? Let me know your gut reaction in the comments. An incredible number of you who watch these in-depth stories are not subscribed. And if you value getting the real, unvarnished facts, you need to hit that button. It is the single most important way you can support this channel. And frankly, it's urgent. We can't keep making these without you. Don't let this kind of journalism dry up. Let's begin. The story begins in November of 1922, at a luxury retreat called Bishop's Lodge, nestled in the foothills of Santa Fe, New Mexico. For weeks, delegates from 7 states gathered to carve up the most important resource in the American West. Their chairman was Herbert Hoover, then the Secretary of Commerce, a man of relentless ambition who saw the untamed Colorado River not as a natural wonder, but as an engine for continental expansion. He was there to broker a deal, fast. The legal mind behind the meeting was a shrewd Colorado attorney named Delph Carpenter. It was his idea to use an interstate compact, a rare legal tool, to circumvent endless lawsuits and assign permanent ownership of the river's water. Carpenter's goal was to protect the upper basin states, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, from the massive thirst of a rapidly developing California. He wanted to lock in their share of the water before Los Angeles could claim it all. So they drew a line. An arbitrary, invisible line in the sand, called Lee Ferry, Arizona. Everything upstream was the upper basin. Everything downstream, the lower basin, Arizona, California, and Nevada. The deal they hammered out at Bishop's Lodge was deceptively simple. Each basin would receive 7.5 million acre-feet of water. Every single year, forever. An acre-foot is the amount of water needed to cover 1 acre of land in 1 foot of water, roughly 326,000 gallons. They were allocating 15 million acre-feet in total between the 2 basins. It was a number that felt solid, permanent, backed by the full authority of the United States government. There was only one problem. The number was a fantasy. The measurements they used to justify that allocation were taken during one of the wettest periods in the last 1,200 years. It was a climatic anomaly, a brief window of unusual abundance, and they knew it. Scientists and hydrologists, even back in the 1890s, had published data showing the river's long-term average flow was far, far lower. They presented evidence that the river naturally produced closer to 12 or 13 million acre-feet a year, not the 15 they were giving away, and certainly not the additional million they later promised to Mexico in a 1944 treaty. Hoover and the delegates dismissed the warnings. They were men building a future, not men constrained by historical data. On November 24, 1922, they gathered at the historic Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe and signed the Colorado River Compact. They had, in effect, given away more water than the river actually had. They had codified a deficit. They had built a time bomb into the very legal foundation of the American West. And for the better part of a century, nobody noticed the clock was ticking. There was another group whose future was being decided in that room. The region's 30 federally recognized Native American tribes, who held some of the oldest and most senior water rights on the entire continent, were not invited to Bishop's Lodge. Their existence was addressed in a single, dismissive sentence. Article 7. It vaguely stated that nothing in the compact would affect the obligations of the United States to Indian tribes. Behind closed doors, Herbert Hoover bluntly referred to it as the Wild Indian article. It was an afterthought. A problem to be ignored. A profound injustice that would fester for 100 years, waiting for its own moment of reckoning. With the compact signed, the great age of concrete could begin. The agreement didn't just divide water. It unleashed ambition on an industrial scale. In 1939, the Hoover Dam rose out of the Black Canyon, a monument of engineering prowess that tamed the river's violent floods and created Lake Mead. At the time, it was the largest reservoir on the planet, a massive battery of stored water and hydroelectric power that would fuel the growth of Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Las Vegas. Then, in 1963, Glen Canyon Dam was completed upstream, plugging the canyons of northern Arizona and creating the nation's second-largest reservoir, Lake Powell. These two behemoths of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation weren't just dams. They were a profound psychological statement. They declared that nature could be conquered, that the desert could be made to bloom, that the natural limits of a dry climate were merely engineering problems to be solved. For decades, it seemed to work. The reservoirs were full, the turbines spun, the populations of Arizona and Nevada exploded. Millions of people flocked to the Sun Belt, building homes, swimming pools, and golf courses in the middle of a desert, all of it predicated on the illusion of limitless water held back by those colossal concrete walls. They had built a civilization on the promise of 1922, a promise based on a lie. The bill for that lie began to arrive in the year 2000. It came in the form of a drought, but not just any drought. Scientists now call it the Millennium Drought, a period of aridification more severe and sustained than anything seen in the region for over 1,200 years. This wasn't just a string of dry years. It was a fundamental shift. The snowpack in the Rocky Mountains, which acts as the river's true reservoir, began to shrink. Runoff into the river system declined dramatically. The climate was changing, and the river was the first major casualty. The two giant reservoirs, Mead and Powell, began to fall. Not just by a few feet, but by dozens of feet, year after year. The decline was relentless. It exposed a haunting bathtub ring of white mineral deposits on the canyon walls, a stark visual record of how much water was already gone. By the summer of 2021, the situation became so dire that the federal government was forced to act. For the first time in history, the Bureau of Reclamation officially declared a Tier 1 water shortage on the Colorado River. The declaration triggered the first ever mandatory cuts to the water supply for Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico. The era of abundance was over. The era of consequences had begun. What does it really mean for these reservoirs to be low? It's not just about less water for cities. It's about a series of catastrophic tipping points. At Lake Powell, the critical number is 3,490 feet. That's the elevation of what's called the minimum power pool. If the lake surface drops below that line, water can no longer flow through the intakes that feed the Glen Canyon Dam's massive hydroelectric turbines. The power station, a critical energy source for the entire region, simply goes dark. Not just that, but air can get into the system, causing a phenomenon called cavitation that can physically destroy the turbines themselves. By early 2026, Lake Powell was hovering just feet above that critical threshold. The system was on the verge of a catastrophic failure. And the forecasts from the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center were terrifying. For the 2026 water year, the minimum probable inflow into Lake Powell was projected to be just 2.78 million acre-feet. That is a shocking 29% of its historical average, one of the lowest inflows ever recorded. The river was failing to replenish itself. The ticking time bomb from 1922 was finally, thunderously, going off. So where is all Ahe water actually going? When we hear about this crisis, the story is often framed around 40 million people in thirsty cities. We see images of sprinkler systems in Las Vegas and swimming pools in Phoenix. But that narrative is dangerously misleading. In reality, about 250,000 residents in a few small cities are 100% dependent on the river. The major metros have more diversified water portfolios. The truth, the elephant in the room that politicians and water managers are often reluctant to discuss, is agriculture. Between 70 and 80% of the Colorado River's water is used for farming. A staggering 74% according to a 2024 study, if you look only at direct human consumptive use. And not just for any kind of farming. The single largest consumer of water in the entire basin is alfalfa. It's a thirsty crop, grown across 5.5 million acres of irrigated desert soil, primarily to be used as hay to feed cattle, both domestically and overseas. Let me say that again. The vast majority of the water from a dying river, in the middle of a megadrought, is being used to grow cattle feed in the desert. As water scientist Ann Castle bluntly puts it, I think we need to have permanent reductions in use on the table, and agriculture will have to be part of that. It's a simple, brutal equation. You can't save the Colorado River by just telling people in cities to take shorter showers. The problem isn't a few million lawns. It's millions of acres of alfalfa. Thirsty cows, not thirsty cities. That's a staggering number, isn't it? Up to 80% for agriculture. Does learning that fact change how you view the crisis and where the solution lies? It's a complex issue tied to century-old water rights. Let us know what you think in the comments below. This brings us to 2026, a year of desperation. With Lake Powell teetering on the edge of becoming a dead pool, the U.S. Department of the Interior, under Secretary Doug Burgum, was forced to make a battlefield decision. In April, the Bureau of Reclamation, led by Acting Commissioner Scott Cameron, took emergency action. They announced they were slashing the amount of water released from Glen Canyon Dam down to an absolute minimum of 6.0 million acre-feet for the year. This was a drastic move, meant to hold water in Lake Powell at all costs, to keep its surface above that critical 3,490-foot power pool elevation. But that water had to come from somewhere. By holding it back at Powell, they were starving Lake Mead downstream, accelerating its decline. To prop up Powell, they initiated a desperate, unprecedented shell game with the West's water. They ordered emergency releases from upstream reservoirs, primarily the Flaming Gorge Reservoir in Wyoming and Utah. They were literally draining a healthy reservoir to keep a dying one on life support. This single decision, moving a total of 2.48 million acre-feet of emergency water, revealed the sheer panic gripping federal water managers. They were no longer managing a river. They were performing triage on a dying patient, robbing Peter to pay Paul, just to buy a few more months of time before the lights went out. The move was immediately controversial. It pitted states against each other. Wyoming and Colorado leaders were furious that their reservoirs were being sacrificed to solve a problem largely created by the lower basin's chronic overuse. Meanwhile, officials in Arizona and Nevada watched in horror as the lifeline from Lake Powell was choked off, sending Lake Mead spiraling down towards its own crisis points. The federal government, once the impartial referee, had been forced to pick a side. In this case, they chose to save the infrastructure at Glen Canyon Dam, and in doing so, they lit a political fire that is now threatening to burn down the entire century-old framework of cooperation on the river. If you have family or friends living in Arizona, California, Nevada, or any of the 7 basin states, please share this video with them. This is not a distant, abstract problem. It affects the water, food, and power security of millions of American families. And hitting that like button to help this story reach a wider audience makes a bigger difference than you can imagine. This political firestorm is happening because the original rulebook is about to expire. The 2007 Interim Guidelines, a set of temporary rules that tied the operations of Mead and Powell together and dictated shortage cuts, are set to terminate at the end of 2026. For the past several years, the 7 states have been locked in brutal, deadlocked negotiations to come up with a replacement plan. They have failed. The deadline to submit a consensus plan was missed in late 2025. Another extension in early 2026 also came and went with no agreement. The states are fundamentally divided along the same line drawn in the sand back in 1922, Upper Basin versus Lower Basin. The Lower Basin states, led by Arizona's chief negotiator Tom Bushatsky, argue that since they are facing the immediate, catastrophic impacts of low reservoirs, the Upper Basin must share in the cuts. They argue that climate change is reducing the river's overall flow, and that burden must be shared by everyone. Bushatsky has been adamant. The Upper Basin can't just expect the Lower Basin to solve a problem that affects the entire system. The Upper Basin states fire back that the 1922 Compact is law. It guarantees them their 7.5 million acre-feet, and gives the Lower Basin the responsibility to not use more than its share. They see the problem as one of Lower Basin overconsumption, not a lack of supply on their end. They have water rights, and they have no intention of giving them up, especially when much of their allocation hasn't even been fully developed yet. The standoff has become a giant, high-stakes game of chicken. Each side is waiting for the other to blink, but no one is blinking. Arizona has publicly stated it is preparing for litigation. Colorado is setting aside funds for a legal war chest. They would rather take their chances fighting the federal government in the Supreme Court than voluntarily give up water they believe is legally theirs. This has created the exact scenario every water manager for the last 50 years has dreaded. The states have failed to govern themselves. And now, the federal boogeyman, as some state officials call it, is about to step out of the shadows. Secretary Doug Burgum has made it clear that since the states couldn't produce a deal, the Department of the Interior will impose its own. By late summer 2026, the federal government is expected to announce its preferred alternative, a top-down management plan that will dictate who gets water and how much they have to cut. Burgum has already warned, in a moment of stark honesty, that nobody will be happy with the outcome. He's promising a plan that delivers equal misery to all. The new plan is almost certain to include unprecedented, painful reductions for everyone. Agriculture, cities, and industry will all face cuts deeper than any ever implemented. The announcement will immediately trigger an avalanche of lawsuits from states, water districts, and farming groups, throwing the management of the West's most critical river into years of legal chaos. The century of the compact is ending. The century of the water wars is about to begin. New Mexico, realizing the gravity of the moment, even made a last-minute change to its negotiating team in June 2026, appointing former Biden administration official Tanya Trujillo to represent them in the final, desperate hours of diplomacy. It's a sign of how high the stakes have become. I know, I'm asking again, but it's incredibly important. Hundreds of hours of research, writing, and editing go into making a single documentary like this one. Subscribing is free, but for a small, independent channel like ours, it is everything. It's our lifeblood. So if you've gotten this far, please, take 1 second and make sure you're part of our subscriber community. Thank you. And what about the tribes? The original inhabitants of the basin, ignored in 1922. Their moment may have finally arrived. The 30 recognized tribes in the basin collectively hold rights to a significant portion of the river's water, rights that, in many cases, are senior to those of the states. In the legal chaos that is about to unfold, the tribes are poised to be major players. For decades, many of their water rights existed only on paper, undeveloped due to a lack of federal funding and infrastructure. But in a world where every drop is contested, those paper rights are becoming as valuable as gold. Any new agreement, any court ruling, will have to seriously contend with tribal sovereignty and their legal claims to the water. The Wild Indian article is no longer a dismissive footnote. It may very well be the key to the river's future. Another layer of confusion that plagues these discussions is geography itself. People constantly confuse Lee Ferry with Lee's Ferry. It sounds like a trivial detail, but in water law, it's critical. Lee Ferry, spelled without an S, is the imaginary legal line 1 mile below the mouth of the Paria River that officially divides the upper and lower basins. It's a point on a map. Lee's Ferry, with an S, is the physical place 15.9 miles downstream from Glen Canyon Dam, with a boat launch and a stream gauge, a place you can actually stand. The media, and even some officials, mix them up constantly, adding another layer of fog to an already impossibly complex debate. The physical reality of the river's end is perhaps the most tragic part of this story. For most of the last few decades, the mighty Colorado River has not reached the sea. Once, it flowed all the way to the Gulf of California in Mexico, creating a lush, 2-million-acre delta teeming with life. Now, due to all the upstream withdrawals, the last 100 miles of its channel are mostly a dry, cracked riverbed. The great delta has vanished, turned to desert. A wonder of the natural world, erased by a century of over-allocation. The river dies before it can meet the ocean. So the third straw, the conservation, the emergency reservoir draining, none of it is a solution. It is a desperate attempt to manage a permanent decline. The models predicting a hotter, drier future for the Southwest are not ambiguous. They point to a future with less snow, less runoff, and a structurally smaller river. As climate scientist Brad Udall of Colorado State University states, "We have too many straws in this glass. This river's down a third compared to the 20th century average, and we need to do something about all the demands. The engineering has run out of road. The politicians have run out of time. The lawyers are just getting started. The compact signed at Bishop's Lodge in 1922 was a promise of a boundless future in the desert, built on a foundation of imaginary water. For 100 years, that promise held. The cities grew, the farms bloomed, the dams held. Now, that promise is broken. The foundation is turning to dust. The river that built the modern West is dying, and 40 million people are living on the edge of a great unknown, watching and waiting as the water runs out.